and welcome back those of you who we met this morning. Apologies, one or two of the slides will be the same, but the vast majority won't. Welcome to everybody who wasn't here this morning, and I hope what I have to say is of interest. The essence of the talk is a discussion of a two-way street, and I think that's really the fundamental message. The links between food and our efforts to achieve food security by whatever method, and this wonderful concept of planetary boundaries that emanated from here in consultation with colleagues elsewhere in the world is, I think, quite a useful way of structuring the discussion. So the question is about this two-way street. I think it's helpful to start with a definition of food security. There are many definitions out there. There are hundreds of definitions in the literature about food security. This is one that I find particularly useful because it puts the emphasis on the economic and physical access to food rather than the production of food. Of course, the production of food is very important, but is subsumed within this definition. It isn't the be-all and end-all of the definition. There's a whole pile of words in there. Imagine it written by a committee where everybody wanted their word. You find it. There are words missing: agriculture, food production, fisheries, livestock. Words dear to many of us we don't see in that because it's attempting to move beyond the commodity to the notion of food and societal access and individual access to that food. The definition is based on the fact that it's more than food production. The definition is as applicable in the African village as in a temperate situation on the right-hand image. And the point about this definition is that it's all very well to have it, but without understanding how we can think about it and how particularly we can research it, it's only so useful. So we take the view from the work that I've been involved in the Global Environmental Change and Food Systems Project, that really this whole food security concept is underpinned by the functioning or not of a food system or food systems. And here's a picture that we referred to over the last few years of one group's interpretation of the global food system. It's hellish complicated. There's a whole pile of stuff in there. You can try and find your favourite topic. You're probably going to find it, unless you're in social science or the humanities or the behavioural science. There's a whole set of slides behind this which one could also design to do with the social sphere as well as the physical sphere. Up here, oh sorry, that's the wrong picture, we have the word food security right up there, embedded deep down. So how do you actually research this? So what we've done in our work is to take this FAO definition and unpack it into researchable elements. And these researchable elements are all housed within a number of major components of food security, all of which have to be present and humming for food security to be met. In relation to food access, we see the affordability of food. That's not just how expensive is the food, but it's a combination of how expensive is the food and how rich am I. That's the point. The allocation of food within society, whether it's at the household level, whether it's at the national level, whether it's at the international level, is terribly important. Decisions are made by people who have power. And the preference is what do we like? That's an important thing not to forget. In terms of the food utilisation, which is the second big component, well, sure, yeah, we have nutritional value, terribly important. We have social value, terribly important. A lot of people may not be thinking about the social value, but actually it's crucial in our self-identity, in our cultural heritage, in our customs, sometimes in our religious processes, and it's part and parcel of the food security definition. If we aren't able to fulfill those spiritual or cultural needs, we are, to some degree, food insecure. And then we have food safety. Obviously, it's got to be non-toxic, it shouldn't carry pathogens, it should satisfy a number of increasingly strict measures. So then we move down to food availability, and this is actually where a lot of the literature is and rests. And we see a massive literature around food production. And as I pointed out, food production is important, but it's not actually in itself the major determinant of food security. The distribution of food, once produced, is terribly important. It might be produced in one part of a village and moved to another part of a village, or in one part of the world and moved to another part of the world. So transport and distribution, transport infrastructure is important. And then, of course, our little word exchange at the bottom, which is to do trade, whether it's financial, as in money, or whether you're trading your labour, or whether you're trading some other, a cow for a bag of maize, or whatever it is. But all the way through, there is the notion of exchange. Unless you're one of the very, very few people on the planet who actually grow all their own food for their own subsistence. Almost nobody is outside some sort of exchange system. So all of these 9 bullet points are all important, and they've all got to be humming for food security to be met, and they need to be stable over time, because if they're not stable, it's very hard to plan. So much for unpacking the definition of food security. But in terms of planetary boundaries, it's these words we come to now that are important. And this is what we've been calling, in the GCAS project, we've been calling the food system activities, which are the things we do as society, as individuals, in order to achieve these things. And what we call the outcomes of these activities are the areas of interest for the food security debate. The activities themselves are the area of interest for the planetary boundaries debate. It's the doing words. All of these words end in ing. They're all doing words. They're producing, marketing, packaging, consuming. They're things that we do, and they all have a consequence. The principal motive, one could argue, is to achieve food security. But doing these things also has other outcomes, which we find in the socioeconomic realm. We find the income or employment of the actors in this set of activities, the human, social, political capital engendered by doing these things in a certain way. But in terms of the planetary boundary, and of course there's an interaction between the social welfare and some of these buttons. For instance, the income and the employment and the wealth will have a bearing on the affordability. But the point of this talk really is to begin to think about the environmental outcomes of these activities in terms of the planetary boundaries, because all of these things have an effect on all of these things. And needless to say, there is an interaction again between the environmental outcomes and the food security concept itself. So, what we've got is the beginnings of a map, a checklist of things that we want to consider in a systematic way, which I argue is an easier research tool than the diagram we had on the board a few moments ago, which was just everything everywhere. Neither is wrong, but this is more helpful from a researcher's viewpoint. So here's the question, the first question of the talk. What are the contributions of these food system activities to this diagram? What does producing, packaging, processing, etc. mean in terms of these red segments? We could start perhaps where people would imagine we'd start, and it's to do with land cover change. And land cover change has been going on for millennia. This is a graph from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which is showing the difference between 1950 up to 1990s, and then projected loss by 2050 of these different biomes in terms of their fraction of potential area converted. And you can see that many of them are reaching up to 60–70% converted. Now, when you go and clear a forest or a grassland and you plough it up and you plant crops or you grow cows or something, there are all sorts of environmental consequences. And I would argue that it puts a pressure on all the planetary boundaries one way or another. One could find a narrative, if you looked hard enough, to explain a link to each planetary boundary. But agriculture is often being cited as, you know, a bad thing in terms of this. Certainly, there's in the order of 13–15% of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture per se, the actual culture. But in the land use and the whole forestry sector, there's even more coming out. So overall, if you include these two things together, we've got you know, a good what have we got, a quarter or more of greenhouse gas emissions are as a result of trying to feed ourselves in that way. 70% of that emissions is actually connected with nitrogen fertilizer. So there's a huge signal from nitrogen fertilizer, not just the nitrous oxide that's emitted when it's applied, but the energy that goes into it. And the harbour process is very energy intensive, and we're going to find that we'll, again, the narrative, you can look back to the amount of CO2 contained in each granule of fertilizer. So, a piece of work underway, reported by Bruce Campbell recently, was the green sectors are an estimate of the proportion of these wedges that actually are, you can say, are responsibility of agriculture, if I can put it that way. So this is taking the basic concept and looking at it through a sectoral lens. Now there's huge debate about the numbers, huge debates about the diagram and the fact that they're triangles and not rectangles and all sorts of things, but the principle is there, and I think it's useful to note the impact that agriculture has. But we're not just talking about agriculture, cropping, and we're not just talking about greenhouse gases. Here we've got a picture of how you harvest tuna very, very efficiently. There's not much chance of escape. You see these trawlers go around in a loop, and there are all sorts of little boats to herd the fish, or whatever the right word is, and wallop, woof, you take the whole lot out. There's a fantastic local impact on biodiversity of this sort of technology. This is very efficient, very efficient. And it's so efficient, in fact, that we see here that we've got 44%, according to FAO, of the world's fisheries are really fully or heavily exploited. And it's a question of how long can this level of technology be sustained in a way which allows future harvest in a sustainable way. So you've got two sustainability questions. You've got the sustainability of the resource and the sustainability of the practice. And one thing's going to have to go, or yield. But of course, food systems, as we've seen in the early diagram, are much more than just producing food. And here we've got the letters in red are some of the other food system activities, and they all have an environmental footprint. What we see here is a chart, an analysis of the US food system by sector, where, sure, 60% is to do with producing food, maybe no surprise, but the important thing about this graph is that 40% isn't. It's about other things. And if we're looking to mitigate the environmental impact, in this case greenhouse gas emissions, from the whole food system, we mustn't forget the opportunities to be found in these sectors as well as the opportunity to be found in that one. Take food processing. Picture of a, I'm not quite sure what, I think they're chickens we've judged. Two things to note. It's highly efficient, again. They're trying to do their best on cleanliness and hygiene and food safety, but you'll also see on the floor a lot of water. And this is all to do with water use. Water use in the food industry is one of the greatest. We'll see that in food processing in a moment. But just the comment here about the effluent from the food processing industry. It's really pretty nasty stuff one way or another. You can run your eye down here, very high nitrogen concentration, large amount of suspended solids, etc. What's interesting and caught my eye is that most have higher levels than is allowed in municipal sewage. So there's regulation about municipal sewage, and it's much more stringent than for food processing. And so when it comes to eutrophication or stuff going into the local rivers, etc., the food processing industry has got a story to tell. Here we see the water use from one study in Canada, which shows in terms of the intake, the discharge, therefore the consumption, that of all the industrial processes, and some industries are very water intensive, steel and that sort of thing, but about, well, just under 5% of all industrial use is to do with water intake, but just over 5 is to do with consumption. That's because a huge amount of water is actually turned into steam in the food processing, so they don't put back into the river anything like as much as they take out. It is a major user of water, and if you consider that people say in the order of 75% of water is used for irrigation, here we've got another 5% used just for food processing. So there's a big water cost. Packaging, there are 2 pictures here. One of them's to do with packaging plant, and the other one's to do with what's left over after we've eaten, drunk, or whatever, the contents. And the point about this is that it's incredibly wasteful, apart from being, you know, a terrible blight on the landscape. Litter, sure. The use of raw materials in these packaging, then you run your eye down, but it's the real and the virtual energy content of this material here, which is obviously a waste in this picture, but is a resource. And we need to think about, A, using less packaging and wiser packaging, and B, recycling packaging a lot more to get more out of it. So there's an environmental story with packaging. Retailing. Here we got a piece from the press of 2 or 3 years ago, which was quite a wake-up call in Britain. We've always been told about the problem of having too many plastic bags from the supermarket, and the headline is not about that, it's about the freezers in the supermarkets and the greenhouse gas impact of the coolant gases that are used in these. They just leak a little bit, but they have huge global warming potential. And what's happened since this report is we've seen a change from sort of CFC type refrigerants to CO2 and generally cleaning up the act. And that's a good thing. So be aware that when we're in the supermarkets, as we presumably all are from time to time, you walk past the freezers, think about that. Just remember that the whole retailing business has overt environmental footprint, and it has things that perhaps we hadn't thought about before. And this is to say that it's all well and good, but slightly old data, I apologise, but the industry is cleaning up its act because it makes good business sense. It's a waste of money, as well as improving your green image or your corporate social responsibility. It's just bad business sense to waste. And so here we have from the Cooperative Group, which is a big supermarket chain in the UK. And the important thing about this is it's a graph of tons of CO2 equivalent per £1 million turnover, which is an appropriate way to report emissions from a business, because they're interested in the turnover rather than just the absolute amount. And I think this is showing a very positive trend. I look forward to finding the more up-to-date data. So, we bought the stuff, we've grown it, we've produced it, packaged it, or else we bought it, and now on to consuming it. Here we see a graph showing the breakdown in energy use in commercial kitchens. And there are a number of things that happen in kitchens. Heating of the kitchen, so that it's a pleasant working environment. Water heating, 19. Cooking, about a quarter. So whereas you might think cooking's the big one, in fact, cooking's only a quarter of it, and it's all these other things which are tied up, if you will, in the carbon, embedded carbon in the cooked product. So again, if we're looking for mitigation, we can be thinking about all these other things as well as more efficient stoves. And here's just a little bit of data which kind of amused me, but it shows the CO2 usage per meal served in kilos of CO2 in a primary school not a lot goes to heating the kitchen, not a lot goes to cooking. The combined is about 100 grams, 200 grams. In a fast food outlet, without saying which, I don't know, honestly, it's a little bit more. In the junior ranks in the army, it's about 1, and in the officers' mess, it's about 2. So that number happens to be about 10 times that number. Think what you like. But the point is, consuming food has, in its own right, got a significant environmental footprint. So, coming back to the topic of the talk, the link between the planetary boundaries and the food systems, here we see a matrix which I'll display, where along the top we have the food system activities, the doing words that we met earlier, and here we have the majority of the planetary boundaries. And again, I say the bulk of the literature is really resting on what's happening with the producing food in terms of greenhouse gas emission and hence the impact on climate. But by thinking about the narrative that we've just touched on, one can actually say something in just about every cell. You can say something meaningful and ultimately quantifiable in every cell. So wherever you go, you could argue that there is an impact from distributing and retailing food on atmospheric aerosols, by shipping. Ships have notoriously rubbish diesel, and there's very high sulfur content, and there's all sorts of particulates coming out from international shipping. So you could find a narrative anywhere in this tableau. But as I said earlier, the talk's about food security, not just about food systems in terms of activities. And so what we need to also ask is, so what's the consequence of crossing these planetary boundaries on our food security, the other side of the story? And we see here the fact that food security has really come up on the agenda in the last half a dozen years or so. Science Mag, Economist, of course FAO puts out a SOFA report every year. Food security is now the big issue. And we saw it in the press. This is a couple of years ago. There was a big, a repeat scare of the food price price spike of a couple of years previous to this. And here's a fairly alarmist headline. Fears grow over food supply. Oh my God, what are we going to do? It hasn't gone away. Here we are just 6 months ago on World Food Day, and again it's making the point that we've got 1 in 7 still going hungry. So the whole area of food security is not only in the political and scientific agenda, it's very much in the public domain now. That feeds back, of course, to the political process. We know a couple of years ago there were over 1 billion people with insufficient calorie. Last year it had fallen a little, but still a horrendously large number of over 900 million. 1 billion people hungry. And this graph, to many, is not surprising because Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, has got all the dark reds and the blacks. As usual, we see the dark colours shaded here. But it's not that there are insufficient food elsewhere. The actual statistics were 265 million hungry people in sub-Saharan Africa, but overall, 650 million people, in absolute numbers, were insufficient food in Asia and the Pacific. And this is because the graph is as a proportion of the total national population. In absolute numbers, over 600 million in Asia. But we also see statistics for Latin America, North Africa, Middle East and the like, and the developed world. It is not all hunky-dory up here, if I can put it like that. We see a remarkable headline from The Economist of a couple of years ago, making the point that in New York City, in the Big Apple, for heaven's sake, we've got a very large number of hungry people, and we've got 1 in 5 of the city's children rely on soup kitchens, which is a remarkable statistic when you think of it. We've seen in the press yesterday, the London Times of yesterday, had this headline, that one new food bank, which is a place where you can go and get free food, opens every week in the UK. So my point is that, yes, there is a massive problem in the developing world, but we mustn't be complacent about the countries in which we live either. The principles of food insecurity are the same the world over. The drivers of food insecurity are the same over. The degree to which a particular driver kicks in will depend on the context. So much for insufficient calorie. Here we've got a graph of anemia, iron deficiency. So in addition to the billion who don't have enough calories, there's another billion who don't have sufficient nutrient. Anemia, this is anemia in pregnant women. Again, as we suspect, sub-Saharan Africa is the most problematic area. So there's an estimated further billion people with insufficient nutrient. And then on top of that, so to speak, there's another billion who've got too much. And so the food system is failing those people as well. They are likely to suffer from disease related to obesity and overeating and all the rest of it. So overall, I could argue that there's 3 billion out of the 7 billion of us for whom the food system is not functioning satisfactorily. And that's something that we need to address. So how do the changes in climate and other planetary boundaries actually affect food security? The question is being asked the other way. And remember this definition of food security. Here we see sort of graph we may be used to seeing, which is the impact of elevated temperature estimated on yield decline in Australia. It gets pretty severe over in the west here. And the point about this is that Australia exports a lot of wheat onto the international market, about 20% of the world exports. And if there is a decline of 15–20% domestically, they're probably not going to suffer directly because they just stop exporting it. They don't actually lose out, but the world loses out, and that's the point. And that will have an impact on the price, the world price of wheat. Further compromised by all sorts of other issues. Here's a little bit of information about ozone, tropospheric ozone pollution. This is a remarkable graph that's showing the percent of annual productivity that is impacted by tropospheric ozone. And this study reckoned that up to a quarter of yield was lost in China due to tropospheric ozone, which is a fantastic statistic. Extreme weather. Here's a picture of a flood in Bangladesh. The point about this picture is it's showing where a railway can no longer work as a result of the flood. And the railway was terribly important for moving food around in the country. Remember the distribution button on the diagram earlier. Once the distribution system gets compromised, then food insecurity immediately begins to grow. It's not just in the developing world. Here's a thing from the Brisbane Times showing when we had the big floods a year ago, saying major supermarkets shut down as shelves empty. Now, for those of us who can only get our food from a supermarket, this becomes a little bit serious. We all have social safety nets in our societies. Nobody died as a result of this. But nonetheless, the food system was stressed and it began to not work. Here we see what happens to food storage. And this is a real double whammy because this was grain stored for use in times of need. Here was a time of need and it destroyed the stock. So a double whammy. Again, think about the consequence of extreme events on food storage. And food safety gets compromised. Here are some ideas of what's likely to be happening with elevated temperature. Everything from marine biotoxins here, pathogenic bacteria, mycotoxins in plant products, etc., etc., etc. This is all well-recorded stuff. I think, though, the most important thing is the effect of weather extremes on price. And here we see a graph of the proportion of disposable income that is spent on food against a log of per capita income. And the line is thus. Here we are, UK, I'm not sure which Sweden is, but something around here, I imagine. And we are spending 10–15% of our disposable income on food. Food for us is actually very, very affordable. This lady here from Bangladesh is spending 70% or more of her disposable income on food, and her disposable income is very small. So any change in the price of food, by, for instance, what's happening with Australia in my example, or any other reason, is going to affect this lady far more than it's going to affect us. And the consequence of that we see on a map from around the world. Here the map showing the graph is the price of wheat and the price of rice over the period leading up to the 2008 price spike. And these export ban restriction symbols are those countries that slapped on an export ban to preserve their own food stock. It was a sort of knee-jerk reaction in some cases, which led on to further problems elsewhere, and those problems were experienced in terms of civil unrest, where people died due to rioting, etc. And since then, there's been a suggestion that the Arab Spring was sparked by price of bread riots in Tunisia, etc., etc., etc. How much you want to take that story is up to you, but the point is, the change in affordability is really a very powerful force. So how do we sort of bring these two things together? We've got here our diagram of the food system activities leading to environmental impacts, and of course the food security outcomes we want. Here we see the socioeconomic drivers in which we all play a role, and here we see the global change drivers, which are by and large a consequence of changes in these things. There are of course some natural impacts as well. The important thing about these two drivers in relation to the food system is that the two sets of drivers interact. And again, I'll refer to the literature, the bulk of which looks at that word, climate change and climate variability, on that word, food production, producing food. But in fact, the story is much richer than that and much more complicated. And if we want to really talk about global change as a phenomenon, we have to discuss it in context of socioeconomic change, and we need to discuss the full story if we want to think about how the food system is affected and affects through the feedback loops, both our socioeconomic context and of course our environmental context. So that, if you will, is the simple picture of what's going on outside the window. It is a simple picture because it's unresearchable if you have trying to link everything to everything. You have to drill into practical stuff. And this is a map, a checklist of things that we need to think about. So I guess the sort of last part of the talk is what do we do about it all? And here are just some ideas. We all have our own views, I'm sure. But one thing is, I think, clear. We have to adapt to inevitable change. It's upon us. And we also need to think about mitigating further change. Think about all the food system activities. And to my mind, adaptation is a kind of complicated word for saying doing things differently. That's what adaptation is to me. And the things that we do differently are, of course, the food system activities. Those are the doing things that we have the opportunity to do differently. Processing, packaging, etc., etc. So if we just think about some of them in turn, in terms of the actual production base, we see the opportunity to have more varied crops, or stress-tolerant varieties, or whole new food-producing systems, or a wider range of foodstuffs. And this is a picture from uglyfish.com, which is a remarkable beast, not one you'd expect to see on the supermarket shelf, but I've no reason to think it's not nutritious. So we've got to kind of get used to novel foods in that way. Adaptation is also about preserving germplasm, and here I'm sure you're familiar with the site in Svalbard, where they're looking after genetic resources for the future. It's to do with improving food storage and reducing losses to pests and diseases and damp when it's already harvested. It's to do with considering wholly novel foods, which may come as a surprise, whether it's Mr. Uglyfish or whether it's actually cultured meat. And this is a graph showing against 100 for beef, the energy use, the greenhouse gas emissions, the estimated land use and water use for sheep, pork, poultry, and artificially cultured meat. It's got quite a high energy content, but actually in terms of land use and water use, it's really very low. Are we prepared as society to have cultured meat? Apparently it's coming on in leaps and bounds. It's still white, because they haven't sorted out the myoglobin bit yet, which makes it red, but in all other regards that it's nutritionally not bad. So what else can we do in terms of mitigation? Well, coming back to the production base, improving nitrogen use efficiency is going to just be such an obvious win-win-win. Here we see a graph of what's been going on in China over the last few decades. The first point of the story is they've had a tremendous success in terms of producing more food, 50% on 1980 increase, which is great. However, they're using nearly 4 times as much nitrogen to do that. So the nitrogen use efficiency is actually pretty shocking. And here we see the number compared to the US, which is pretty much in balance. China, we've got a terrible nitrogen use efficiency, expressed in terms of inputs minus outputs in the crop. And in this example in Western Kenya, it's actually nitrogen insufficient, so there's a negative value there. So thinking about nitrogen use efficiency is obviously a good thing to do. In terms of tillage operations, reduced tillage has its pluses and minuses. It doesn't matter where you are, it's still basically a good thing to do in terms of carbon, because you need less energy to do it, and you don't oxidize the soil carbon so much when you do it. However, weed control is a problem, getting the tilth right for the seedbed can be a problem. So it's not a panacea, but it's an interesting step. In terms of actively sequestering carbon in the soil that a lot of people are talking about, well, this was a nice analysis that Ken Kassman just did on the back of an envelope. And what he showed was that basic soil organic matter has got a C to N ratio of about 12. So that means that each ton of carbon we wish to store in the soil, we're going to need about 80 kilos of nitrogen. Then you look at the money. That's the sort of amount it costs per kilo. So the nitrogen cost of 1 ton of soil organic matter is about $71. Can't argue with that. Problem is, the carbon isn't worth that. So economically, it's bonkers to try and farm carbon, given the current price of carbon and the current price of nitrogen. You can't do anything about the percentage nitrogen in soil organic matter, by and large. So again, just a reminder that what one might see in everything from the popular press to the academic literature might not actually be viable, however scientifically possible it is. Another form of mitigation, of course, is food miles, and a lot of people have been talking about food miles. This is a map of what it takes to make a pot of strawberry yoghurt, and the arrows are the quantities of material coming from various points in Germany and outside, and it's from a report called The Well-Travelled Yogurt Pot. And it's just a reminder that when you buy something which is produced, packaged, distributed, retailed and all the rest of it, it's got a story behind it. And something as innocuous as a pot of yogurt has got a complicated story like that. And I guess the last thing to say is, what about us as individuals? What do we think? We are both citizens, but we're also consumers. And we're citizens and consumers at the same time, and often that produces a tension within ourselves when you're in the supermarket. Ooh, that's a 2-for-1 offer, I like that. Is it the best thing to do from an environmental society point of view? Don't know. So I think what we need to do as individuals is think about a number of things, accepting less choice. I'm always completely staggered when I go into a big supermarket. We have a small supermarket where I live, and it seems to satisfy my needs. I don't need 25,000 different food items which are available to me in a big supermarket in Oxford. I wouldn't know where to start. But obviously there is a demand, according to the supermarkets, that their customers want this stuff. Modifying our diets is something we can do. We don't need to completely change. We don't need to abandon meat, for instance, and only eat carrots. But just a change in balance could have some significant and immediate impacts. This is some data showing what would happen if, big if, everybody in the States changed from meat 7 days a week to meat 5 days a week. So it's not asking people to change completely, but just to modify. And what you see here is that the amount of million tons of CO2 would be reduced by over 100 if that happened. And I'm coming on to this in a moment. The amount of waste, CO2 in waste food would also be reduced dramatically. And on the point of reducing food waste, it's not just a question of leaving something on your plate, although there may be somebody around who's happy to eat that, but it's also noticing that you've got waste all the way down the food chain. Indeed, at the top here, off the board, the waste from the input into the farmers, the waste at the farm level, the waste at the processors and all the rest of it. And the point about waste is that by the time you've noticed it, it's normally too late to do anything about it. So you need to preempt it, and you need to block that leakage in the food system. I don't know which commodity you'd like to talk about, but I've seen good evidence that up to 100% of a commodity can be lost post-harvest due to poor storage if it's a fresh vegetable. Figures of 15 to 30% are very common for food lost post-harvest. And indeed, we see of the amount of food that is grown, 4,500 calories per person per day of edible harvest are produced by the world. By the time we've lost some to post-harvest losses, fed it to animals, lost it in our distribution chain, we're down to about 2,000 calories per person per day, which is actually what we all need. Of course, we don't all get that, so there's something screwy with the system. And it depends where you are, where the problems lie. In the developing countries, about 40% of the lost food is on farm, and almost none, i.e. you can't see the blue figures really at the end of this line, are lost and in the food service industry and post-purchase. People just can't afford to do that. It's madness anyway. Whereas in our societies, we see, because of our advanced, relatively speaking, technologies, maybe only 10 or 15% is lost at the farm level. But once we've bought the stuff, we throw 40% of it away when we get home. I mean, it's an extraordinary phenomenon. An extraordinary phenomenon. So in terms of societal change and personal change, here are some alarming statistics. To close, just some information that I got from the Food Ethics Council, which is a really good body in the UK. Their estimate is that we're throwing away, in money terms, 250, 400, 500 pounds a year per family, which is madness. That if we didn't do that, it could significantly reduce the number of people who are hungry, although it's not exactly as if the stuff I don't throw away can be put on a boat and sent somewhere, but the principle is there. And that the additional greenhouse gases that we are emitting as a nation due to throwing away food and wasting food accounts to about 5%. So it's immediate win to be made. And I think the closing comment I have really is that alleviating food insecurity, which is very much a challenge, by reducing our food waste, is really as important as aiming at alleviating food insecurity by learning how to produce more. And we see again and again the call to produce more. We need to double the world's food supply by 2050, whatever it is. Never seems to take into account, yeah, but we could do a lot of that by just throwing away less. So, I do think, I don't wish to preach at all, but I do think that there's a bit of an issue there which we all need to think about. It makes environmental sense, it makes economic sense, and it certainly makes ethical sense. So, there we come to the close of the talk. We've been trying to think about the two-way street, and I hope the message is there, that it's a two-way street, and it's not just about what happens at the production base, and it's not just about climate, it's about the whole suite of food system activities and it's about all the planetary boundaries, and that they interact very dynamically. And in terms of management and governance of the food system, we really need to up the act to control the processes that are going on so that we're less wasteful and more efficient with our knowledge and our resources. Thank you.